Hi, I'm Amanda Hunt, the Director of Education and Public Programs here at MoCA, Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon at the Geffen. This is Adrián Villar Rojas's The Theater of Disappearance, which is an incredible installation that we are so excited to have supported and be sharing with the public here in LA. And instead of a more traditional art historical take on what's on view, we are just over the moon that Jon Christensen is here with us today to provide an environmentalist context to the work, to talk us through some ideas about the Anthropocene era in which we live as humans, what is at stake in the world today, globally, in our environment, and built and otherwise. So please join me in welcoming Jon in just a moment. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on who he is. First, Jon is a co-founder of the Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies in the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he investigates how to tell stories, create art, and make sense of our world, which is quite a task, I think, in 2018. He is an environmental journalist and science writer and has been for over the last 30 years, so we will hear so much about a lot of the research I think that Jon's done over his long career. You may have heard his voice on KPCC's Take Two program sometime in the morning on your drive, or seen his writings in the New York Times. He's been quite prolific in his work and publishings and is currently finishing a book titled Critical Habitat: A History of Thinking with Things in Nature. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's special guest, Jon Christensen.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here today, and thank you for coming in this afternoon. I'd like to start by acknowledging my profound debt in this talk to Ursula K. Heise, my partner in life, the universe, and everything. She's here with us today, including as a co-founder of Lens. Thank you. Please go ahead. So much of this talk. If books have more authors than appear on the front page, as Ursula notes in the acknowledgements to her new book, Imagining Extinction: The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, so do lectures, and this one especially. The things I have learned through our conversations throughout the writing of her book and our mutual adventures with colleagues in the environmental humanities and sciences, first at Stanford and for the last 5.5 years at UCLA, are woven throughout this talk. Imagine a future archaeologist on a dig in what was once downtown Los Angeles, excavating, exposing the layers of history, like the paleontologists at the La Brea tar pits are doing today, finding bones of saber-toothed cats, mammoths, and dire wolves. What does our archaeologist of the future find? Trashed sneakers, pieces of meat, broken prosthetics, disemboweled electronics, parts of robots and birds, collections of feathers, skeletons, lobsters, roots, tubers, birds' nests, shark skin, spiders, beetles, mushrooms, papaya, bread, seashells, palm fronds, amphora, a bicycle wheel, pendants, a cross, seahorses, bones, blood, lianas, codfish, a sickle, a broken egg, coral, amber, erratics, vertebrae, petrified wood, seed pods, a sandwich, a prosthetic hand holding bones. Out of the fragments, our archaeologist begins to try to piece together a story, a history about our times. This is one of the roles that the Theater of Disappearance casts us in, as we walk around with our phone flashlights, forced into the role of discoverer, digger spelunking a past that looks like the future or the present, exploring layers of history, memory, a still life, nature morte, tableaus of our own frenetic time, slowed down by sedimentation, glassification, embedding in concrete, refrigeration, so that it can be contemplated as part of a much longer, even geological arc of history. This is also the role that the Anthropocene casts us in. This term, the Anthropocene, was first proposed in an article published at the turn of the century by Paul Crutzen, an atmospheric scientist, and his colleague, Eugene Sturmer, an ecologist. They argued that we no longer inhabit the Holocene, the period from the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, up to the present. Indeed, Holocene means entirely new or recent, or if you will, the present. Crutzen and Sturmer argued that the present, as we had conceived it, was actually over. It is the past now. Human beings have so transformed Earth, they argued, that our impact will be visible in geological strata in the future and will mark a distinctive boundary in the history of the planet. They proposed to call this new epoch the Anthropocene, the human age. They said the Holocene had ended around the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the steam engine. The burning of fossil fuels since then, especially in the period of the Great Acceleration after World War II, along with exponential population growth, nitrogen production and deposition, biodiversity loss, and climate change, have all left distinct traces around the world that will be readable in the geological strata by future geologists. The Anthropocene puts us in the position of those future geologists looking back on our own present. Now, as you can probably imagine, if you haven't already been immersed in it, there is no end to debate about the Anthropocene, starting with when it might have begun, to what it means for us today, to what's at stake for the future, and even what it should be called. Some have proposed the Homogecene as a better label for our epoch, because globalization is causing the planet to become more homogeneous, ecologically, economically, and even culturally. Others have proposed the Capitalocene, because capitalism, after all, is at bottom really responsible for the mess we're in. While geologists are still in the formal processes of examining evidence for the Anthropocene and have not yet come to an official decision about whether to accept this new nomenclature, and if so, where to put the boundary, the Anthropocene has already taken on a vibrant cultural life quite apart from the scientific debate among geologists. As shorthand for not only human dominance of vast portions of Earth and its life forms, but also for a fundamental shift in the relationship between people and nature. Interestingly, this shorthand has come to mean two quite different things. On the one hand, for pessimists, the Anthropocene is a new version of what we environmental historians call a declensionist narrative, a venerable old story template about decline, end times, the fall from grace. Crutzen himself fits this mold as he catalogs the damage we have done to the planet. During the past 3 centuries, he writes, the human population has increased tenfold to more than 6 billion and is expected to reach 10 billion in this century. The methane-producing cattle population has risen to 1.4 billion. About 30 to 50% of the planet's land surface is exploited by humans. Tropical rainforests disappear at a fast pace, releasing carbon dioxide and strongly increasing species extinction. Dam building and river diversion have become commonplace. More than half of all accessible fresh water is used by mankind. Fisheries remove more than 25% of the primary production upwelling ocean regions, and 35% in the temperate continental shelf. Energy use has grown 16-fold during the 20th century, causing 160 million tons of atmospheric sulfur dioxide emissions per year, more than twice the sum of its natural emissions. More nitrogen fertilizer is applied in agriculture than is fixed naturally in all terrestrial ecosystems. Nitric oxide production by the burning of fossil fuels and biomass also overrides natural emissions. Fossil fuel burning and agriculture have caused substantial increases in the concentrations of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide by 30% and methane by more than 100%, reaching their highest levels over the past 400 millennia, with more to follow. The New Yorker writer Elizabeth Kolbert condensed this view of our human-dominated age when she tweeted, "Two words that shouldn't go together, good Anthropocene." On the other hand, the Anthropocene has engendered an equal and quite opposite reaction, an odd celebration of our awesome powers, perhaps best exemplified by the noted nature writer Diane Ackerman's latest book, The Human Age, The World Shaped by Us. Our relationship with nature has changed, Ackerman writes, radically, irreversibly, but by no means all for the bad. We're at a great turning, our own momentous fork in the road. Behind us, eons of geological history. Ahead of us, a mist-laden future. And all around us, the wonders and uncertainties of the human age. These days, startling though the thought is, we control our own destiny. We're not passive. We're not helpless. We're earth movers. We can become earth restorers and earth guardians. We still have time and imagination, and we have a great many choices. Our mistakes are legend, but our talent is immeasurable. In between the poles of this the triumphalist techno-optimists like Ackerman and the prophets of gloom and doom like Kolbert and Crutzen, there's plenty of room for middle ground, which is well represented by the science writer Emma Maris, who explored this third territory in her book, Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. In an op-ed in the New York Times, Maris joined geographer Earl Ellis and biologist Joseph Mascaro and our UCLA colleague Peter Kariva in rejecting the declensionist narrative while proposing a moderated path forward in a thoroughly altered landscape. The Anthropocene does not represent the failure of environmentalism, they wrote. It is the stage on which a new, more positive and forward-looking environmentalism can be built. This is the Earth we have created, and we have a duty as a species to protect it and manage it with love and intelligence. It is not ruined. It is beautiful still, and can be even more beautiful if we work together and care for it. Now, I hope you're already wondering about some big questions we might ask about each of these narratives. And we can get into as many of those as you'd like in our conversation today. But let me point to 4 of what I think are the most important ideas that we might want to focus on as guideposts as we think about the Anthropocene, particularly in the context of the theater of disappearance. First is an idea that might be best conveyed by the riposte. What do you mean, we, white man? The Anthropocene, in its most basic form, and in many of its specific formulations, posits human beings as a species, as the we who are responsible for this new human-dominated Earth. But the 1 billion wealthiest inhabitants on Earth have contributed the most to the problems cataloged by Crutzen and others, and reaped the most benefits too, while the bottom 3 billion have added very little to the burden, benefited hardly at all, and will suffer the most from the consequences of the Anthropocene. And many of us have come to understand that what makes us different, nationality, race and ethnicity, gender, class, religion, culture, language, and other facets of our existence, identity, and experience may be just as important to who we are as our biological species, and in some cases, much more important. So who's the we here in the theater of disappearance? Does the exhibition in the museum address itself to some public or publics? Does it assemble them around these objects? Who are we over the course of the exhibition's run in this room today? Let's take another angle on that question. Who's the observer here? Is it someone in the future looking back on our times? Or is it us in the here and now? Or both? And how does that change the way we see the world within these walls and outside? We're asking who the audience is. We should also ask, who is the protagonist in this story? Who gets to tell this story and why? Is it the artist, Adrián Villar Rojas? The 19 collaborators from Argentina, Brazil, and France who work closely with him on these exhibitions? The 58 MoCA staff listed in the catalog? The wider circle of 61 more people acknowledged in the catalog, including many in LA who helped with this exhibition, including Omar's Exotic Birds, Soil and Sod Depot, Legacy Rock and Waterscapes, Milk Bakery, Farmers Market Poultry, and Valeria's Chilies and Spices. Is it all of us, the species, Homo sapien, or the assemblage of objects and life forms brought together here? On a related note, who curates such a show? How did it get here? Who gets to call this art? Some of these questions are answered in the catalog for the exhibition, which I highly recommend to you, especially the mind-blowing conversation in the catalog between the artist, Adrián Villar Rojas, and MoCA curator Helen Molesworth, which is worth reading and rereading. I will only touch on a few of the things that I learned from the catalog and their conversation here as we move on to some of the other ideas excuse me, and questions raised by the Anthropocene and the theater of disappearance. The second big idea has to do with agency and intentionality, and who and what we think has agency here. One of the tropes of the Anthropocene is best characterized by the futurist and technologist Stuart Brand's famous quip, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." Brand said that in 1968 around the founding of the Whole Earth Catalog. He has lately modified that slogan in the light of the Anthropocene and now says, "We are as gods and have to get good at it." One might well wonder, however, where the optimists of the Anthropocene, and there are many like Brand, get their bold confidence. We might even call it hubris, that in the future we'll be able to manage the planet so much better than we have in the past. This is especially curious when you consider the fact that some of the most fundamental human transformations of the planet were unintended consequences. No one planned for climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, widespread toxification. No one intended these results. These are all side effects of other activities. So what would make us confident that the best of intentions would be good enough in the future? And so much is beyond our control, from the sunlight we depend on, to earthquakes that threaten our cities, to the swarms of crown-of-thorns starfish now devouring the Great Barrier Reef. Much of nature and its processes, large and small, remain resolutely non-human agents. Here in the theater of disappearance, we might ask such questions as, who left all this stuff here? What were they doing with it? What were their intentions? What happened? How did these things come together in these layers and strange assemblages of the human and the non-human, the animate and the inanimate? And is this art? And if so, what makes it art? In her conversation with Villar Rojas in the catalog, Helen Molesworth suggests that it becomes art the moment we ask that question. Adrián Villar Rojas says that all these leftovers from previous exhibitions have been recycled in a kind of second life here at MoCA, completing a journey from art to prime matter and then art again. 111 volcanic rocks, chunks of marble and petrified trees, as well as hundreds of organic materials, including the remains of birds, fish, decomposing meat, jewelry, boots, and glass, formed part of Rinascimento, an exhibition in Turin, Italy in 2015, and were shipped to Los Angeles to become part of the Theater of Disappearance, along with stratified columns from Planetarium, an exhibition at the Sharaj Biennial in the United Arab Emirates, and silicone molds that were part of the Istanbul exhibition, The Most Beautiful of All Mothers. Was all this intentional? Sure. But the artist does not control it entirely either. Some of the placement of objects is determined by chance operations and encounters during the design and installation. And as Villar Rojas told the Argentinian newspaper La Nación, as the exhibition takes shape, I don't have, nor do I pretend to have, any control over the semiotic dimensions of the material that I liberate, he said. Everything that happens is an effect of the total emancipation of these agents, including the actual material understood as an agent. The third big idea that I'd like us to consider might not be as obvious because it hides in plain sight. You may be able to feel it, sense it, but it's not visible. It's outside the frame. Adrián Villar Rojas and Helen Molesworth call this housekeeping. And it's central to the work of the artist, particularly here in the Theater of Disappearance. In fact, it is in some ways the most important thing that disappears. And by disappearing is meant to be called to our attention. As the artists put it in their conversation, if I had to choose one word for us to discuss together, a word that has implicitly traversed our dialogue during these past 2 years while they were putting together the exhibition, planning it, it would be housekeeping. What do they mean by that? Read the catalog for sure. As I said, it's well worth it. But in short, it is the hidden work here, the cleaning, renewing, and reorganizing the space, as the artist says, that made this spectacle possible in this former police warehouse, redesigned as a museum for contemporary art by Frank Gehry. It is the invisible labor that has to be done for the spectacle to exist. Perhaps here, it is slyly shown in that small empty room within this big room that looks like a back room, but is clearly not at all functional. The empty Easter egg that seems to mock our looking for something behind the scenes. All signs of housekeeping have disappeared, but housekeeping has not and never will. One of the things that I feel certain will survive in 100 years, says Helen Molesworth, is that somebody is still going to have to clean up. This attention to housekeeping has an interesting parallel to another significant idea at the center of the Anthropocene, and that is domestication. As Peter Kariva and others argued in the journal Science a decade ago, one important feature of the Anthropocene is that people have domesticated nearly the entire world. Humans did not stop with simply domesticating a few chosen species, they argued. We have domesticated vast landscapes and entire ecosystems. Ours is a world of nature domesticated, albeit to varying degrees, from national parks to high-rise megalopolises. Under this paradigm, our challenge is to understand and thoughtfully manage the trade-offs among ecosystem services that result from the inevitable domestication of nature. So while we may not be as gods, we are at least as household gods in the Anthropocene, charged with caring for our thoroughly domesticated planet, if you think about us charitably, or cleaning up the mess we've made, if you're more realistic too. But here's the rub, as Helen Molesworth notes. Housekeeping occupies no position of privilege in any narrative, she says in her conversation with Villar Rojas. Nobody wants to talk about cleaning up. No one wants to talk about the dust under the bed. And this then brings me to my fourth question, and it may be the most important one. Whether we're even capable of thinking about and telling stories about the Anthropocene. The great Indian writer and novelist, Amitav Ghosh, explores this question in his recent book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. I highly recommend that to you too. Ghosh builds a provocative, important argument across 3 essays on stories, history, and politics that originated as 3 lectures. I won't rehearse all of them, but instead just briefly invoke his argument about stories. Ghosh says that modern literature, and the novel in particular, has left us ill-equipped to think about the world we live in now. The novel, with its focus on individual protagonists and realistic plots and settings, cannot help us think about a world determinately shaped, not by individuals, but by our collective actions and their unintended consequences. A world in which we have become as powerful as geological and atmospheric forces, and yet we are also, it seems, powerless in the face of these forces. And we now live in a world in which the real seems to be growing increasingly weird. As ice caps melt, hurricanes and typhoons more powerful than ever rampage north and south more frequently than ever, and floods, droughts, and fires plague around the world. Now, science fiction is a genre that has no trouble spanning grand scales of time and space and incorporating the agency of the non-human in settings that are not only realistic, but downright weird. Science fiction also functions in ways that are interesting and useful for understanding the Anthropocene, and I would argue, the theater of disappearance. As the literary theorist Frederick Jameson famously argued, the function of sci-fi futures is to put readers in the position of seeing ourselves and our times, the present that is, as the past of a future yet to come. The most characteristic SF, Jameson writes, does not seriously attempt to imagine the real future of our social system. Rather, its multiple mock futures serve the quite different function of transforming our own present into the determinate past of something yet to come. Our present is unavailable for us for contemplation in its own right, Jameson says, because the sheer quantitative immensity of objects and individual lives it comprises make our postmodern condition so untotalizable and hence unimaginable. Our present is also occluded, he argues, by the density of our private fantasies and the proliferating stereotypes of a media culture that permeates every remote zone of our existence. But when we return from a visit to the imaginary future of science fiction, our present, he says, is offered to us in a new form. The form of that future world's remote past, as if posthumous and as though collectively remembered. Science fiction, Jameson argues, thus provides, enables, and indeed enacts for the reader a structurally unique method for apprehending the present as history. This method is especially powerful with dystopias and apocalyptic narratives that can, if we are so inclined, encourage us to think about what we could do in the present to try to ensure that the dystopian future does not become reality. I feel some of that here in this room. Do you? But there's another slightly different method at work in some science fiction that is also at work in this exhibition. And we see that often in sci-fi that is not set in some distant future or on some distant planet, but instead in near future scenarios, in a world sometimes so close to our own present, but changed in some fundamental and momentous ways that are nevertheless sometimes not quite immediately identifiable. The world in this science fiction is barely distinguishable from the present, but it feels quite different. It makes us feel uncannily different too. In this version of science fiction, as Ursula writes, our world is presented as if it were science fiction. This feeling is best captured by William Gibson's oft-quoted quip, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." While the first method of science fiction puts us in the position of being the past of an imagined future, the second method puts us in a future that is already materializing, and in the process, making our present already obsolete. The theater of disappearance works both of these angles. This is the future we already inhabit. And it is the past that a future observer could look back upon to try to understand what on earth we were doing here. In her conversation with Adrián Villar Rojas, Helen Molesworth said, "Your work suggests that it is possible that the museum and as an institution might not survive the 21st century. But the whole kit and caboodle, civilization, humanity, the earth, are also on the wane. This puts me in a vexed position. It means I don't know how to be your curator." Clearly, she figured it out, and we're grateful for that, because the theater of disappearance opens up important questions about our time here on Earth. As Helen Molesworth suggests, and their conversation in the catalog explores in more depth, the theater of disappearance also opens up important questions about the role of the artist, the curator, and the museum, as well as audiences and conversations like ours in the Anthropocene. The artist closes that conversation, and I want to close my talk with a provocative observation about all of this. Reflecting back on Greece, where he was in residence in 2016. He notes how central ancient Greece has been to a certain idea of Western civilization, and how that idea was constructed, designed, he says, at the same time as archaeology developed in the region. So who is this designer, he asks? Obviously, the digger. And who is the digger? The American, British, French, and German schools, he says, whose respective national states were designing their own democratic, rationalist, and even supremacist roots, the legacy inherited straight from the ancient Greeks during the last part of the 18th and 19th centuries. One single fact is enough to illustrate this idea, he notes. The largest and most ambitious archaeological venture in Athens, excavating a large portion of the city to discover the Stoa of the Athenians, was funded by Rockefeller. At the same time, all these excavations erased the quote-unquote undesirable Ottoman past. The excavations were intended to recover, to design this white Western culture, he argues. And yet the Persian and Ottoman cultures crossed all over Greece and are so deep inside its history. This kind of deletion happens all the time, all over the world. The theater of disappearance is a different kind of archaeology, a different kind of presentation of history, a different kind of museum exhibition. It points to intriguing new possibilities for the future. Instead of a Wunderkammer, a cabinet of wonders that is part of a colonialist enterprise, cataloging the wonders of an expanding empire, the theater of disappearance works to decolonize our past, present, and future. Instead of a modern and, dare I say, contemporary museum that is about projecting some ideal versions of humanity and the nation through art, the theater of disappearance turns the museum into a global representation of our cosmopolitan species and our messy, multi-species assemblages. In another move that defines the Anthropocene, history and natural history can no longer be separated and are not separated here. I do believe there's a much more committed way of relating to and constructing our past than to just clean, reshape, and tell a partial story, Adrián Villar Rojas says in his conversation with Helen Molesworth. We don't have this distinction in the Spanish language between history and story. It's very interesting to think that in Spanish, it's historia. Historia is storytelling and history. I always find it quite meaningful and confusing when I'm speaking in English, he adds. Is this history or story? Even on a personal level, do we say our history together or our story together? So who are the diggers and designers of the Anthropocene here in the theater of disappearance? Who are the housekeepers? Are the diggers outside looking in? Where are the housekeepers? With our phone flashlights, our tickets in our pockets, having arrived here from somewhere else, having sorted the recycling and put out the trash, left our beds made or unmade, I suspect we're not looking in from the outside. We're imbricated and implicated in the theater of disappearance. Now, can we take these questions, this conversation, this housekeeping, beyond these four walls and inflect the arc of history in which we are embedded here? I am eager to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Sure. If anybody has any thoughts or questions, I'm honestly would be delighted to hear your thoughts or questions.
You mentioned the critique of novels and literature that's hyper individual as a place to position yourself in history. What are more collective strategies to kind of envisioning yourself as a systemic actor rather than like a character in a novel?
Well, I think this would be a great conversation to have with Ursula, who does a lot of work on this and thinking. And science fiction often has those strategies of imagining collective and non-human agency, enormous spans of time, and some of which come from the ancient traditions of the epic as well. Where there are forces beyond our control. Some of them are personalized in some ways as gods. So those are all strategies that are still at play and can be used. I mean, it may be that in some senses, the brief period of the modern novel, if we look back from 100 or more years, may appear as this brief interlude where we thought it was all about the individual, the liberal subject, the agent, that those were the stories that need to be told. And in fact, we do have ways of telling other stories. I think we also have to invent those new ways of telling stories today. That's one of the things that we're interested in at LENS, at UCLA, our Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies, is how to do that. And I think that's one of the things that is really, most struck me so deeply about this exhibition, is that it's doing that. I think there's a lot of different questions we can ask about it, opinions, that we can have about it, but it's Adrián Villar Rojas's work in the Theater of Disappearance here at MoCA and in the other places where it's been done is about asking those kinds of questions and revealing the things that are hidden in the production of art, in the production of this myth of the great power and agency of the individual. So there's I think there's a lot of interesting strategies out there that can be put to use in new ways.
Hi. I was thinking about this idea of caretaker, and you sort of touched on it, but that the position of caretaker inherently includes a sort of hierarchy or position of authority, and often we're in these situations where we are trying to control environments or our relationships to environments and end up with all of these unintended consequences, as you mentioned. And so I guess my question is about methodologies that would deal with more participatory approaches. And if you think about those kinds of practices or participatory practices in your work as a scientist, because also it feels that science is still a study that has this position of inherent authority. I'm not sure if this is a question, but just kind of curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, it's even worse than that. I'm not a scientist. I'm a humanities scholar and maybe a social scientist, and I use methods like a magpie from different kinds of disciplines. But for the most part, we, the historians, do our work, completely alone in archives. But that's changing. Increasingly we do work in groups with teams doing, big projects, bringing in, data and analyzing data, and all of the, and scientists often work in, they work in big teams now these days too. You'll see science publications with 15, 16, some of the climate change sciences had more than 50 names, as authors on papers and things. But there still is this hierarchy, right? And where you know, so much of the essential labor and knowledge is hidden, you know, behind the author, you know, or the artist, you know, who stands up here like this and, you know, takes, sort of has this air of authority. And I think that those questions are very, very much alive and important, you know, of how do we develop methods that are more participatory, that acknowledge, you know, all of the contributions that people make, you know, that lift people up, you know, instead of hiding. I mean, these are all kinds of important questions that I think are asked around this exhibition, but even in the exhibition, just coming into it, you don't necessarily see them. They're hidden. They're hidden still. So these are the you know, really important kinds of questions that need to be asked. I think, especially as we take our work, you know, outside of the walls of the museum, outside of the walls of the classroom or the laboratory, and start, you know, working with communities. Then, you know, that kind of participation becomes really, really important and complicated. But it's just that essential. There is something, you know, really essential and important about doing it, figuring out how to do it, you know, trying and sometimes failing, you know, and trying again. Yeah, that we're participating with it. And so then you expand that out and think, you know, that, I mean, and I think this is one of the things that's raised in the exhibition, you know, that you know, how much of the natural world that we depend on that makes our own bodies, you know, the food that we eat, the ecosystems that we're, you know, embedded in and that provide us, you know, clean air, clean water, solace, you know, beauty, all of these kinds of things. And I think this is one of the things that's happening in the Anthropocene and is happening here, you know, in this exhibition and in this assembly, you know, it's that it's about those relationships. It's about that, you know, what Ursula has called, you know, this multi-species community or multi-species assembly, that in some ways you can look, even our supposedly individual bodies, you know, these liberal subjects are a multi-species assemblage. We have all kinds of, you know, bacteria and other things in our bodies that keep us alive. And that's part of this shift that's happening in the Anthropocene and that is happening here, I think, in this exhibition, is this decentering of that human subject. We're not at the center of the world. You know, this is, you know,
you actually came around to it by the end, but it was about collective storytelling, and I think that with technology today and all the interconnectedness of humans, enabling people to come together and tell the story together, and the idea that, yes, a group of historians, but not just historians, but community, which is what you ultimately said, which is if everyone's a part of telling the story, then we all have a stake.
We'll take one more. I think I saw, was there a hand back here? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I just had a quick question about the subject, because I feel like it's kind of a bad word in terms of thinking about sort of assemblages of different the object and the non-human being a part of the story that we're trying to tell. And I guess, and I'm involved in work thinking through that too, and it's a value that I have in my own research. But I've just been wondering about, we still are have capacities as subjects, and to what extent is the moving away from the human subject a kind of a, how do we distinguish that from like a political sort of like surrender, or, you know, sort of like, I'm overwhelmed by acting, so I'm just going to reach to the non-human world, or I'm going to mitigate my own subjectivity in order to be able to feel like I can exist. So just, what about the subject now?
Yeah, you know, you remind me of this conversation I was having with another artist, a Turkish artist, who was using that way that we talk about the subject, and it was kind of confusing to the audience because, I tried to talk with him about this because I said there's this confusion in English. You know, we use the word subject both as like I'm the subject of the actions that I take, on the world. I'm the protagonist of my narrative. But we also use it as like, really the opposite, as the object, that I'm the subject of, this sentence or these actions or, possibly even something like the state. And so there's a really interesting confusion in there, which I think is productive. But I think your other, aside from that, I take your point. And it's really something that's important to think about carefully, is like, what is the political work that, decentering the human and, putting us or, on the same level as, animals or plants, or natural processes. A lot of times in history, that has done very dirty political work, in which human beings have been, considered non-human. So these are really super important questions, and there's another, lingo that people talk about, this flattening of ontologies, right? Where everything, these agents, all these agents in this room, they all, as the artist said, he doesn't control how they interact with each other and what they mean. They all have agency. Like, it does obscure the human agency. It does obscure the agency of the artist and his 18 compatriots and 61 people, and the people around the community who did the work again. So it's a careful thing, and the political theorists, and it's political. It is political. It should be. It needs to be. The political theorist Bruno Latour, has talked about that we need a parliament of things. So it's not just human beings who are represented in the parliament, but it's birds, and it's fish, and it's lizards, and it's rivers, and whatnot. But how would that actually work? And I think it's an intriguing idea, and in some ways, this is a parliament of things, that is all speaking in different ways to us, who are assembled here. But it does, come down to, I think, and I think this is where, it does come down to, who's going to speak for the lizards or the birds or the river? It is going to have to be, the artist or the writer or the activist or the scholar or the politician. So we need to think through these, these kinds of really important and thorny and difficult questions. There aren't easy answers. In Ursula's book, she proposes a concept of, multi-species justice. How do we actually take that seriously and begin thinking about, the justice, deeply important, concept, and in our world? How do we begin thinking about that seriously? In ways that could really work for the future, in the midst of, these kinds of very, very complicated assemblages of all kinds of agents and actors. So I want to thank you and thank the Geffen Contemporary here at MoCA for inviting me. If you're interested in continuing the conversation anyway, I'm happy to hang around a little bit. And you can also find me easily online, my email and everything else. And I really appreciated the opportunity to talk with you, particularly here this afternoon. Thanks.